focusing today on second person action inquiry and the importance overall of trying to triangulate in one's life, one's professional life in action, and one's scientific inquiry, if any of you consider yourselves scientists, how we're trying to triangulate between first-person action inquiry that we focused on last time, second-person action inquiry, which we focus on this time, and third-person action inquiry, and particularly third-person action inquiry that includes both second and first person, which is my claim to be generating a new scientific paradigm, which, by the way, I'm having a good time introducing this to people interested in consulting and coaching, leadership in the practice area of the world, which I care about greatly having an influence on. But I'm having just about zero luck at persuading any of my former colleagues in social science to take a look at this, and even if they were to be very critical about it, to write some reviews or something. And in general, now after 6 months of the book being out, I can assure you that there is no one advertising this book other than you all and a few other people who have heard about it. So I beg you, if you think it is worthwhile to do so, to share this with colleagues, and if there are little journals and newsletters that you could contribute a paragraph review of it to, I'd be incredibly grateful. Let me turn then to today's event. Second person action inquiry is incredibly important, as I'm sure you all realize, for anyone who's a professional in the fields I just enumerated, because it's precisely in our engagement with a client in second person action and hopefully second person inquiry that your work gets done. And so to treat it as though it's all irrelevant from a scientific point of view is kind of crazy. And one of the things that second person action inquiry permits you to do that is practically impossible, but not quite entirely impossible, in third person action inquiry, and that is to treat what's happening right now in front of us as data and as the possible source for an intervention tactic or strategy. Of course, in order to be able to do that, we ourselves need to be in a first person state that is not so totally identified with what's going on that we can't imagine an alternative, that we can't take a step back inquiringly within a second or two, and then perhaps advance in our next action a way that deepens the action inquiry. So that advantage of including data from the present moment, which is an inconceivably huge advantage, is one that's virtually unknown in third person science. It permits us to make timely interventions. And as you've probably picked up, my view of what science and professional action ought to be about ultimately is trying to develop our capacities for timely action. And as you'll see in the book, I gave you a lot of pages you could look up if in fact you're already reading the book, as I devoutly hope you are. There's many more pages than the pages I enumerated that have close interpersonal examinations of practice in the moment, which I hope will be helpful to other people in their practice. Moments that, as you will have noticed, include extremely personal moments, not just professional moments, because action inquiry is meant to be something that helps us in our entire life, not just our professional life. If you've been reading the book, you may remember, I'll just mention two things very briefly. You may remember that there's an example from the second summer that I was running the Yale Upward Bound program, which we had navigated rockily the first summer, but successfully in many ways. And in the second summer, after the riots in the New Haven schools and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the second summer was even more tumultuous than the first summer had been. And we had a critical meeting at the end of the first week with the students and staff, which we had also done the first year and come through with success in terms of resolving a terrible conflict that had occurred. But in the second summer, when you would think I was more prepared to lead in a situation of conflict like that, I actually regard myself, and so did a lot of other people, as having failed. So that the comparison of those two specific incidents was terrifically important in my gradual development of greater capacity to deal with conflict. And again, as you will have noticed if you read, there are many episodes about me trying to learn how to deal with conflict over a number of years. And while I think I did make progress and really succeed pretty well after 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years of struggle about it, it took a long time. And I think that is how long it will often take any of us to develop a significant new capacity. The other example I was going to mention is the example that came from the first weeks when I was at Southern Methodist University some years later, when we had only 2 weeks to develop a group of 10 staff members who had never met one another. And we had to create an entire curriculum for I think that term, it was a 250-person course, which we intended to make an experiential course, which was totally new for the students and totally new for the faculty. As we got to know each other, because I had a good friend from Yale who was on the faculty, who also had some of these skills by now, and I had some of these skills, we were able to confront some fundamental issues within that staff group during the first 2 weeks that generated a whole lot of trust and was absolutely key, I think, to our being successful during the semester. We also used a number of third-person action inquiry mini studies during the semester to get students' reactions so we could tell which of our staff were doing well and which weren't and what kind of feedback they needed. So this was an example of making a really big difference in helping move to later action logics within a small group so that it could in turn help a much larger group. So I've gone into some detail on those examples because I think the detail is key in second person action inquiry. Now, Sarah, if you'll put up the table that they haven't been given yet. So here you came all prepared on these other things, but can we put up so what we're going to talk about today is not so much two-person or examples of second-person research, but examples of how a given community, and we're using the word very broadly here, looks like at different action logics, and how we can move towards creating community of inquiry, a true community of second-person inquiry, where people are willing to challenge one another and challenge the assumptions that the team is making, and challenge the assumptions the larger organization is making successfully. So here's a very, throw some words on a paper, look at what a community might look like at each action logic, right? So gangs at the opportunistic level. Gangs can be street gangs. Gangs can also be very high level autocratical gangs that operate when necessary by extreme unilateral force. And the diplomat action logic, the great example is high school cliques, with their incredible in and out, painful ways of regulating themselves, where only the most insiders of the clique have the say as to who becomes or stays in a clique. And then we've had a lot of talk in the last 50 years about communities of practice. And it's interesting because most communities of practice that we know of are probably expert communities who decide to have lunch once a week and talk about how to do software better or deal with a glitch they've got. Very useful, but very much restrained within the existing frameworks of the business they're working for typically. A great achiever group, I think, are the CEO breakfasts, where you get to know other CEOs in your city and you pray together to show your deep devotion to something higher than profits, and then you make deals for the rest of the time to show your success in being an achiever. Now, at the Redefining Action Logic, therapy groups might be an example. Here, the focus is more leaning towards inquiry together and what inquiry needs to occur for us to change our actions significantly and be less neurotic or in one way or another. And then at the Transforming Action Logic, you get a combination of inquiry and action so that you're not just being reflective as at Redefining, you're actually working, you're a working team in a business. You have to produce something, but you also want to develop the team members and develop the team as a whole so that it plays a more strategic role in the overall development of the organization. And then at the Alchemical, I just say spiritual, political, and I should now add ecological movements, where in some cases you are inspired by alchemical leaders, such as our young Norwegian friend who's growing older every day, but Greta seems to have found a way at an unbelievable young age to play a really catalytic movement. And it's not just her, but she's certainly a great example of that. And then at the ironic level, you can have liberating disciplines that are third-person structures that help other people in the organization begin to develop and create their own groups at later action logics. So Chuck is going to talk about, you know, your involvement in different groups, and I'll let him take over now. Oh, I should say, before I hand it over to Chuck, maybe I already mentioned it, that we will have two breakouts, substantive breakouts as we go forward. Chuck.
Thank you, Bill, and hello, everyone. I apologize in advance for my voice. I have a touch of something. I've tested negative for COVID in the last week, although I hear the new variant is contagious over Zoom. So if you could please just sit a little bit back from the screen, that would be good. Very pleased to do this with Bill. Bill has influenced our work at the Center for Creative Leadership for a long, long time. And this is one of the main ways I think that we've really benefited, this idea that communities can occupy the spectrum of action logics. And I must say, Bill, I like the use of the individual logic chart to map communities. It's a little simpler that way. And it allows people to, I think it allows people to see that action logics are really embedded in communities. I tend to think that we get our action logics from communities. And of course, it's also the other way around, but it's certainly at least reciprocal. And with our clients, we've really had a lot of success in leading them to talk about interdependent logics, which occupy this upper tier of development from redefining onward, which is sometimes called post-formal or post-conventional. And Bill has pointed out his latest preference in the language, which is convention constrained for the conventional logics and convention creative for the post-conventional or post-formal. So I'll try to use that. And we're going to look now at communities of inquiry, which Bill has associated with alchemical, but we're going to blur that a little bit and invite you to consider communities that are convention creative. And I think it's hard to draw sharp lines amongst the logics at the higher level. Our hope is that by developing towards alchemical, then good things will happen. So consider communities of inquiry that you've been a part of. And Sarah, have you been able to post in the chat? I have instructions for you, reflection questions that'll really occupy you for the next 40 minutes. And here's what I'd like you to do. So for the first breakout groups, which you're about to go into in trios, and by the way, the groups will be the same for the subsequent breakout. So hopefully you have some accumulated familiarity with each other's place in all this. And so I'd like you to consider 2 reflection questions, and then I'm actually going to have you jot down notes about this in silence for a few minutes. So as you look at this on the screen and listen to me, you can already start jotting down notes, not long answers, but just enough to get you going. So question 1 is, are you now part of a community of inquiry which spends a significant amount of time in convention creative mutual expressions of power? So a current community of inquiry that's post-conventional or convention creative. Or maybe it's an and, or are you now part of a convention constrained community which you would like to develop toward more convention creative logics of power and inquiry? So choose one such community. It's either presently clearly a community of inquiry of some kind with a lot of convention creative stuff going on, or I think probably like a lot of us, or maybe most of us, you're in communities that are sort of convention bound, and you'd like to find ways to move those along a little bit. But the choice is yours for which one you'd like to talk about. I think the key point, though, is development is possible. And that's what we're really focused on, not trying to ascertain where the community is at any moment, but what kind of development is possible and how might that happen. So jot down a few, choose one such community, remember, just one, and then jot down a few notes about the community. What are the strengths of the community? What are the developmental challenges of the community? What's your own role in the maintenance and further development of this community? What might transformation of this community look like? And for your inspiration, you have been sent from Sarah in a prior email the table that has it's the table that has power, wealth, inquiry, and love alongside the action logics. Maybe by referring to that, yeah, there it is. We are aiming at the next page. For communities of inquiry, yes. So these are the convention creative kinds of logics. So, consider, does your community have some of these, maybe in nascent form? How might you move along from sort of top to bottom? What does that look like? What does transformation look like? So enough from me. We're going to time about, let's give it 4 more minutes since I've chatted a bit. 4 minutes just to jot down a few notes and keep this in mind. one more minute. All right, I'm going to call you back together again. And in just a moment or two, we're going to go into trios to talk about this. And the instruction for the trio is, and Sarah will put this up as well. So just simply discuss the communities you have in mind. Which are the relevant communities that stand out to each of you in your lives, and what are their strengths and challenges and how much they develop? Just a couple of things. One is that we'll be in the same breakout group, so you'll have continuity. And as you'll hear in the instructions for the next breakout groups, we're going to ask you to see if you could create a community of inquiry in just these brief breakouts. I know at one level that's absurd, and maybe it's an ironic task you're being given, so don't worry. But what might it even mean to be in such a short temporary group and have it be kind of alchemical? Just food for thought. And so here's one suggestion. The first breakout will be 10 minutes. I recommend you go around in a quick survey of the group, and everybody maybe spend 30 seconds or something just naming the group and providing a bit of context. Because in the second breakout, we're going to ask you to pick one person to be a focal point of inquiry, to sort of, be in the middle of the group and be the object and subject of inquiry. All right, does that make sense? So let's go, Sarah. Welcome back. The main question for the next 10 minutes is, how was it? You could either unmute yourself and just speak up, or perhaps you could put something in the chat that you have something to share, and Sarah and Allison can pick up on that. But really would just like to hear what you talked about in your groups. There's perhaps two categories. One would be communities that are presently communities of inquiry that are pretty convention creative already. And you're just sort of figuring out how to maintain and advance that. And then maybe let's start with that, and then we could move to the aspirational communities that are more convention constrained, but aspire to be more convention creative. So, or you could just have a general comment about what you talked about in your group. That's okay, but just dive in, unmute yourself and just dive in. I can tell that the spirit is moving someone right at this very moment.
I'll dive
there
in.
We go. Great.
So I'm actually in a Gurdjieff type community, as Bill was for some decades. And, it's a very reflective kind of space, but somehow is missing. I don't know what it's missing. It's kind of missing maybe second person, third person, and trying different things. I've been in it for I don't know how long, 15 years, and it's great. A very, very kind of open space to examine our kind of inner experiences. But I want to be trying things like Romek mentioned, circling, or I want to try things with big-minded, different things that feel like they'd help that group to test its own presuppositions and so on. It's a bit egomaniacal to even say that, of course, that I'd know better than the group, but but I kind of feel like, you know, even a group that's in a very, very late stage place in some ways is not in that same place in certain other ways. I do not have the leverage to change that, but it does wind me up a bit. So that was my group that's doing half of what I want it to, but not the other half.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just your statement that you're not in a position to do that is a statement that there's not mutual power in the group if people are unable, sort of from the rank and file, to speak up. So that's very interesting. Others, what did you talk about in your groups? You can talk about your own community or what you heard from someone else, as long as we keep it in the room here.
I want to urge everybody to unmute themselves, everybody, as a first action towards participation.
Great. It's a liberating discipline, Bill, unmuting everyone.
I'll jump in. Actually, I can offer something a little bit in contrast to what Matthew brought forward. The group that I'm looking at is a professional peer learning consortium. And in this group, the focus is mostly on second and third person. And I'm not detecting a great deal of first person in it at all. So my interest is in shifting the balance in that direction. Also, as a group that has formed to help each other find answers, it's interesting to me to see if I'm going to be able to shift it more toward an interest in the questions.
How do you think that is, that they're not as interested in first person inquiry? Is it something characteristic of the group or its members?
Oh, I think it's characteristic in general of business culture until you start to see populations of the later action logics. So in that respect, this group probably isn't very different from the communities that surround its members in their workplaces.
Yeah.
And I think it's also been sold as a problem-solving venue, and people tend to look outside until they learn that the issues are often inside.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've always been taught from Bill and others in the community that to do collaborative developmental action inquiry necessitates leaving oneself open to development and being aware of that development.
Absolutely.
That's actually been very useful in our work at the Center for Creative Leadership, which started out with a super strong first person exploration with feedback and all that stuff. And then as we develop into more teams, organizations, and even society, just having all those levels on the table is just very powerful, because that's when people start getting, I don't know, really vulnerable and open to development, and you see a whole side of people that you don't otherwise see.
I couldn't agree more, Chuck. Then that's the absence of that is the first thing that I noticed when beginning to encounter this group.
Let's see if we can get at least one more. Laura.
I have a comment. Yes, my group had a very interesting discussion. We discussed, two of us had convention creative examples of groups we're in. Mine was a coaching circle. We've been meeting for 7 years now. It's just for women. And there was another example. But our third example was one of kind of a convention constrained organization that someone was in, even though his action logics were more towards a convention creative. And so we talked about, Chuck, you mentioned the idea of, are we embedded in organizations and kind of do that? So in this case, the person's choice to be there, even in an action logic, which was a little constrained, was interesting. And we were also wondering if the great migration or the great leaving that's happening in organizations around the world right now is really a call of curiosity about, I'm tired of doing this in this way. I don't want to be embedded here anymore. I choose something different because I am different.
Chuck, can I respond to that for a sec?
Yes, please do.
if I can remember what I want to say. Take over, Chuck. Sorry, I lost that. I'll come back.
Oh, I'm having a coughing fit, so we're all discombobulated here.
You really pushed our limits here, Laura, with you. Let's see. Well, the point I wanted to make was that this question of who influences who, the organization, the individual, or the individual, the organization. It obviously does work both ways, as Chuck first said, but the part I'd want to emphasize is that it mostly works on the side of the organization influencing the individual in the early action. And it begins to shift to where the individual at the later action logics can have an influence on the early stages. Although unfortunately, when you move into the redefining action logic, you're not yet quite ready to do that. And you're still in a struggle as to whether you're really that constrained. You're just beginning to learn, and you really need groups outside the early stage organization to help you realize how you can intervene creatively. And I think you're absolutely right that the pandemonium, the pandemic, has pushed people toward redefining. I'm unemployed for the moment. I'll be damned if I want to go back and find the same place to work if I ever have the luck of working again. So I do think that's urged people toward redefining. But they'll of course be in a way. Maybe they'll be successful at finding an organization that is at later action logic and therefore helps them move and they can feel mutual with it.
I'd like to share that I feel quite privileged to be part of since a few months only, part of an independent consulting community that is really, well, I would estimate them at definitely post-conventional redefining stage. It's the best professional community of inquiry I've been a part of, which shows itself in the way it's inclusive and the way everyone's engaged. I guess the developmental challenge is more in the direction of I detect a sort of being in love with inquiry at some moment.
No.
where we're so in love with questioning everything and the assumptions behind our questions and so on, that there's almost like a resistance to agreeing on some coherent ways of moving forward. And yeah, I don't know if you have something to say to that, Bill, that being in love with inquiry and how can we act to move a group beyond that point where I actually experienced a lot of resistance, like, no, we don't want to try and agree on anything.
Well, my point with that is that every process needs to move first into a divergent mode and then into a convergent mode where you take action as a test, as a further test of inquiry. So if you escape the action aspect, you are actually stuck. And that needs to be, you need to find, and the actions can be tentative, obviously, welcoming feedback to see whether they are actually successful. And even the people who resist the action, taking action, ought to, as an experiment, try to take action on something and see how it works for them.
Thank you.
I think it's about time for our next group, right?
Yeah.
So instructions are fairly simple. Sarah, go ahead and post those in the chat. So this next breakout group will be the same as your first breakout. We're going to give you 15 minutes this time, just an enormous amount of time to sort of deeply explore the questions you have. And like I said, to add pressure, would like you to self-consciously regard your breakout groups as temporary communities of inquiry. So go ahead, alchemists and ironists, go wild. So enlist one person in the group to be focal because you won't have time to explore 3, I believe. Join with that person. It's mutual power after all in exploring the community they have in mind. And it's the same kinds of questions. What are the developmental challenges in moving that person's community toward more convention creative expressions of power and inquiry? And for your aid, we offer that table that was up earlier that show the various action logics in relation to wealth, power, inquiry, and even love, which I love love. How about that? So go ahead and we'll call you back in 15.
Unmute yourselves again so that we're more of an active community. And we really hope that a few of you would comment not only what you may have learned or been helped with if you were the focus of help during that period, and also the degree to which you feel as though you move towards community of inquiry status as a little group. So please come in. Let's have short delays between sharings. Bob? Oh, I thought you were.
Yep, sorry. Yep. Well, I'm happy to actually start off. We did not have any one of us be the focus of inquiry. We started out with a question from Anna, and that led to a rich inquiry. And so it was collaborative, it was interactive, it was, and it was sort of an action inquiry kind of cycle with Anna and Corinna. So, and we all felt like it was generative in a way that it was Anna's word. So it felt really good and rich, and it was short, so we could have gone on longer.
Well, that's great. You redefined the purpose of the meeting right at the outset, and then went on. That's terrific. Let's hear some more. I'll try to.
I was happy, if I can step in, Bill. I was happy to use Halim as a sounding board for expressing some thoughts that I was aware of but never spoke out, which were embarrassing to hear myself saying these things. And doing that actually, and I wrote them down as well, so I've visualized it now, and that helps me to more consciously reflect on it and think about, okay, what are my next steps here?
Fabulous. And it emphasizes how absolutely central the practice of vulnerability is in the late action logics. That's marvelous.
This is Michael. This is a reflection after we finished our session with Eric and Maurice. I realized this now relates to power in any kind of co-inquiry, how we a priori, or I did a priori assume that I knew something about inquiring together, that I brought some expertise to that conversation. And I reached a point where I said, no, wait a minute, I have to hold my horses here. Not assume that I know what I'm talking about, that I am the one who asks the question, but I need to be the one who also is willing and open to learn. So not to fall into the trap of being the expert because we're doing something we have done our entire professional life.
Right.
And that goes back to vulnerability.
Yes, indeed. And in a sense, it becomes harder and harder the more expert you are. So and yet the degree of assumptions we are making, you know, here I am in the midst of a professional conversation with other people, and can I even imagine leaving my head and not knowing where I'm going deeper in the body and experiencing a feeling that I didn't expect.